We've been talking about some different structures and some different domiciles where people may like to put their assets. But what we're going to look at now is some regulatory updates regarding one of the trends we're seeing amongst investments generally, and that's ESG investing. So this is the agenda of my presentation. I'm going to start off giving an introduction and some definitions, because as we'll see, there's quite a few different definitions used in the ESG or sustainable finance world, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to look at some recent market developments that we've been seeing internationally. I'm going to talk about some regulatory developments at the international level. And then the main part of my presentation is going to be talking about European Union legal updates that we've seen being either passed or currently in draft over the last year or so. Before I finish up, I'm going to look at the US position and then open for questions. So first of all, the introduction and definitions. What we're talking about generally comes under the umbrella term socially responsible investing. And this has been defined as any investment strategy which seeks to consider both financial return and social and/or environmental impacts to achieve change regarded as positive by proponents. Now, it's quite clear when we read that definition that a whole multitude of different investment approaches and strategies could theoretically fall under that umbrella, either to a greater or lesser extent. And in fact, there's an absence of any single legal definition, and there's various different definitions used by different parties. And that inevitably means that there's differences in reporting, collection, and evaluation of relevant data on this subject. And one of the key roles of industry standards, and we're going to see some developments in this regard I'm going to be talking about later on today, is ensuring consistency so that we can compare like with like and ensure that when people say they have a socially responsible strategy, that they actually do, and the extent to which they actually have such a strategy. Now, there's three central factors that have been identified in ensuring something is a socially responsible policy, and these are the ESG. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to define those as per the European Commission's definition in their Sustainable Finance Initiative, just so that we're all on the same page and we're using the same definitions. So first of all, the E in ESG, but we're talking about our environmental considerations. And this involves things like climate change, mitigation, or adaptation, so that reducing your carbon footprint, for example. Environmental issues more broadly, such as pollution, dealing with pollution, various land uses, mining, etc. And then environmental related risks, including natural disasters, landfills, landslides, things like that. The S stands for social considerations. Is it addressing inequality or inclusiveness? Is it trying to involve marginalized groups, for example? What is the relationship with labor? Are unions recognized? Concepts like this. And then is there investment in human capital and communities? And finally, the G. The G stands for governance considerations. And this relates to management structures in both public and private institutions. And it encompasses the whole range of aspects such as employee relations and executive remuneration. Because it's been identified that the fundamental means of ensuring that the E and the S factors are actually acknowledged in the decision-making process is to ensure that they're hardwired into the governance of the overall strategy. Now, the European Commission has done a lot of work on ESG. It deems these to be integral parts of sustainable economic development. And it's really trying to grow the whole sustainable finance industry. And this is defined as finance to support economic growth, while at the same time reducing pressure on the environment and taking into account social and governance aspects. So part of this involves ensuring transparency of the risks related to ESG factors and then trying to mitigate those risks. So that's essentially what we're going to talk about here. I want to talk about what we've been seeing in this regard in the market. So here's the first slide I'm going to show, and it just shows the annual increase in flows into ESG funds. So you can see that these have been growing reasonably steadily since about 2009, and they really exploded last year. And the source of this information is CNBC and Morningstar. The next, so they're individual year-on-year investment amounts, investment flows. But when we look at the cumulative effect of this, we see that the overall level of assets under management in ESG funds is really surging. It's exponential growth. And that's a picture just illustrating that growth there. Similar situation in the US, again, just the cumulative total of assets year on year is growing, so that the overall total is really becoming rather substantial now. And then in this last graph, we're going to get a view to the future. So this was created as of the end of 2018. We've already seen that the further growth predicted on this graph has in fact happened. And if we look at the forecast amount, it's looking at an increase of over 100% in the next 8 years or so. And that's both mutual funds and ETFs. And again, that's data from Broadridge, BlackRock, very reputable sources. So the key message, I think, from all of those slides, all those different sources and looking at different market segments, is that the ESG section is receiving exponential growth. Now, there are differences between the US and Europe and the rest of the world. Different market segments are maybe growing faster. Different types of fund products are maybe becoming more popular for ESG investments than others. But the general trend of exponential growth seems pretty much universal. Now, I mentioned that there are different definitions around ESG, and there is a need for standardization. We just looked at 4 different sources of data. I'm sure all of those are very reputable, and I'm sure their methodologies were properly carried out. I'm sure that the data from one year to the next in each of their individual surveys is accurate, but whether there is compatibility and transferability between different entities' data is open to question, because they're all using different definitions. So there isn't necessarily a direct transfer. So one of the things that we're going to see is that part of the regulatory impetus has really been trying to ensure that there is standardization in terms of measuring ESG results and what constitutes an ESG investment strategy, so that we can measure things more accurately. Now, we've talked about the exponential growth and the classification issues, but one of the reasons why we're going to see further growth is that we're really moving from what has been essentially an optional marketing strategy, as sort of a nice to do, into more of a regulatory driven environment. So there are, as we're going to see later today, imperatives now towards more accurate characterization of funds in the ESG spectrum, and also in terms of categorizing their data. So let's look first of all then at international developments. And the international developments are being created and driven by supranational governmental and non-governmental institutions, but also industry organizations. At the top level, we have a lot of input from the United Nations. And when we just look at the first item there, it goes all the way back to 2006. So a lot of the work started even before the last financial crisis. The principles of responsible investment were published back then. There's a bit of a lull. I mean, some work did occur over the crisis, but most focus was elsewhere. But in 2012, at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio, we saw further progress being made. That led to the Paris Agreement on climate change. 197 countries signed up to that. That in turn, of course, had built on previous work of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Paris Agreement has once again been in the headlines quite a lot recently because of the Trump administration purporting to step away from it. But even with the US standing down or potentially leaving it, many of its proponents say it is still valid. We also saw the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals. Now that, as we see, as a big driver of what's been happening in the European Union. Now that most of that is happening at a United Nations and intergovernmental level, but we're also seeing a number of non-governmental organizations and associations doing a lot of work behind the scenes to ensure the consistency and the uniformity of definitions that are really required for this to grow. And examples there include the Global Reporting Initiative and the Sustainability and Accounting Standards Board's work. Um, Now that's sort of quite a high level of some development that's been going on. But what I'm going to look now are at the European Union specific developments, legal developments in the EU pertaining to ESG. So I mentioned the UN's 2030 agenda, and as a result of that, the European Commission appointed a high-level expert group, which published its final report in January 2018. That in turn led to an action plan on sustainable growth, how the EU is going to address the issues identified in that UN program. And this in turn also led to the EC Green Deal, which was published in December of last year. More recently, we have the Sustainable Finance Strategy that just came out 2 months ago, and that is more of an operational document which shows how ESMA, the European super regulator, will be implementing this in practice. So we've seen a whole raft of specific pieces of legislation. I'm going to talk through those and just give a high-level overview of each of them in turn. Just on this first slide here, I've just listed some of the key ones. I've given their full title on the right-hand side. They're quite unwieldy titles, so I'm going to stick to the short form title on the left-hand side. But if people get the slides afterwards and they want to Google the underlying legislation, it's all available there. The key thing that you can take away from this particular slide, apart from the volume of legislation that's coming down, is that both regulations and directives are being used by the European Union to advance this. Now, the European Union has different legislative instruments that they can use to ensure regulation is adopted, and regulations ensure maximum harmonization and consistency among member states. Because when the European Union adopts a regulation, it's automatically effective right across the Union, and individual member states don't have to do anything further for it to become effective. On the other hand, directives have to be transposed into local laws, and individual member states have the right to make some interpretations and make an element of change. For example, gold plating, they can supplement the regulations, or the directive rather. Now, so the first three items are all regulations. They're all completely new areas, and these are being brought in, as I say, at the maximum harmonization level. MiFID, UCITS, and AIFMD, we have existing directives relating to those, and the EU is building on those and amending them to ensure that they are ESG compatible. So let's look at the first thing, known as in short form as the Climate Benchmarks Regulation. Now, we've already talked about the need for consistency and clarity and uniformness. So what this does is it seems to make the person producing a benchmark responsible for ensuring that the methodologies that are used are consistent and meet certain standards. So the producer of the benchmark is known as an administrator, and it's subject to specific obligations. And under this regulation, there are two specific new climate benchmarks that are being promulgated. One of them is the EU Climate Transmission Benchmark, and then the other is the EU Paris Aligned Benchmark. And in fact, this legislation is already effective in part. So it became effective last month. And so people, administrators who are producing climate transition benchmarks need to abide by this disclosure, just to show that they are indeed consistent with these uniform standards. And that will allow then different funds that are abiding by this standard to be compared on a like-for-like basis. The next regulation I'm going to look at is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. This applies to all financial market participants, and that can be both at the investment manager level, but also the product level. So there are different disclosures at the two different levels. And again, the aim here is to ensure a harmonized series of disclosures, either for managers or for products. And this applies for all entities that come within scope, but it applies to a greater level where a financial participant is specifically promoting ESG aims. And we call those kind of entities light green, and then also those that have an objective to produce a sustainable investment, call those dark green, because the fundamental objective of those entities is around sustainable finance. Now, this disclosure regulation will actually be live next spring, which will be upon us sooner than I think people may realize. And it will actually be live for all annual report disclosures from January the 1st, 2022, so not too far away. So what types of disclosures are we talking about here? Well, the first one are pre-contractual disclosures. So investors need to know the extent to which a product complies with ESG criteria. So these will, in practice, largely be prospectus updates to the offering documents, inclusion of specified disclosures. You'll also need to include on your website specific policies and how you're abiding by these ESG requirements. Periodic reporting will need to be updated, for example, your annual and semi-annual reports, to ensure you have adequate and standard reporting on the various headings. And then finally, marketing will need to ensure that it's consistent with these obligations. What's the nature of the disclosures? Well, they'll need to include and integrate sustainability risks in investment programs. And to the extent that there are adverse impacts on the sustainability factors, they will need to be explained. So for example, if you're engaging in a significant investment that you know is going to cause a lot of pollution, or for example, deforestation, you're going to need to disclose that. There's going to be an overall requirement for sustainability related impact. So investors will know, if they invest in an enterprise, how sustainable is the activity that's engaging in, what kind of effects is it happening, is it producing a large amount of carbon, is it deforesting large areas, is it producing a mine waste, for example. The last of the three regulations we're going to look at is called the Taxonomy regulation. And again, this is part of the process of trying to have a uniform classification system or framework around sustainable investment to try and ensure consistency. The big concern with enterprises claiming to be green or to be carrying out socially responsible investing is they're actually engaging in a process called greenwashing, whereby they're, from a marketing perspective, they're saying, yes, we're engaging in social responsibility, social investing, and we are adopting a very environmentally friendly approach. But in fact, they may not be doing so, or they may be doing so to a much lower extent than they're leading people to believe, or to other competitors. So the whole idea is to have a uniform and standardized approach so people can see the extent to which investments are actually complying with any ESG standards. And when we look at this regulation, we can see the specific headings that are set out that can be used, such as climate change mitigation or adaptation, sustainable use of resources, protection of the environment, prevention control, and similar such items. There will be obligations for relevant financial market participants to disclose their alignment with these obligations. And the effective date of this is actually December 2021. So this is, again, almost a live requirement. The obligation is fast approaching. I'm going to look now at some of the draft amendments. We've looked so far at the regulations. Now we're looking at draft amendments to existing directives. So MiFID is the regime that regulates most asset management entities in Europe. This is equivalent to sort of broker-dealer regulation in the US. We're currently in the MiFID II regime. We went into that about 18 months ago when we upgraded from MiFID I to MiFID II. And now we're proposing, or it's proposed, to update the MiFID regime to take into account ESG requirements. So MiFID companies will be obliged to ensure that they have internal ESG-focused resources where these are relevant to their services. And they're going to need to carry out a sustainability analysis on investments that they're making. The risk management process and the conflicts of interest process will need to take into account sustainability risk. And then when they're dealing with clients, they're going to need to recognize the ESG preferences of clients and then give them the option of investing in ESG products or not. And they're also going to need to categorize the products that they're selling in terms of their ESG compatibility. Similarly, the existing UCITS directives and the AIFMD, which is which regulates alternative investment fund managers and indirectly alternative investment funds, is also going to be updated to ensure that sustainability risks are recognized and integrated into management responsibilities, and also that they're built into the conflicts of interest policies, that due diligence is carried out bearing in mind sustainability risks, and that risk management policies are updated to take into account sustainability risks. Now, I've dealt with the primary pieces of legislation there, the regulations, which are already in advanced state, the draft directives, amending the existing directives. But in fact, there are other EU ESG legal initiatives as well. I've just listed some of these here. Changes to the non-financial reporting directive, a new green bond standard whereby financial instruments can be sort of given a green stamp of approval that they meet certain environmentally friendly standards, an EU eco-label framework for financial products, and then the update of the CRR and Solvency II regimes which relate to credit institutions and insurance companies. So I'm going to leave this section with an overview of what's happening, and we can see there the whole list on the left-hand side of different regulatory initiatives that are going through at the moment. The second column shows their current status, and as mentioned, some of those are already finalized and in the process of implementation. Others are not too far from that, and the actual timeline is included in the third column on the right-hand side. The final section I'd like to deal with is just an overview on some US updates relating to this. This is important because of course, the size of the US investment market. Many of the leading investment houses in the world have a home domicile in the US, and they operate through branch or subsidiary offices around the world. It's also the case that the US typically leads in terms of investment styles and investment trends, and the rest of the world lags increasingly only a short way behind at the moment. So it's interesting to see what's going on over there, to see what the updates in that regard are. I would say at the outset that I'm not a US attorney, and this is very much a high-level overview. If people are looking for a deeper dive, I would recommend that you download the presentation entitled ESG Considerations for US Asset Managers, prepared by my US colleagues in Dechert. We can send on the slides, or they're available online on our webpage, and that gives in a much deeper dive. But at a macro or high level, what I can say is that unlike the case in the EU, whereas we've just seen there's some very specific pieces of legislation that are being promulgated at the moment to make ESG motivated investments or disclosures, in the US that tends not to be the case. Now, there are different regulatory bodies with different areas of responsibility in the US. For example, the SEC is responsible for Advisors Act, etc. The Department of Labor is responsible for ERISA and related matters. And these different regulatory bodies have issued statements and some guidelines in relation to ESG. But as a whole, they're taking more of a principle-based approach based on existing obligations rather than changing the legislation, the underlying legislation. And when we look at the existing principles, it's worth noting that these really impose an obligation to ensure that the asset managers act in the best interests of the underlying clients. And as part of doing that, they need to show that they're trying to achieve the best economic return for the underlying clients. So what this means in practice is that they may potentially follow ESG strategies if they improve investment performance, and there's no prohibition on following ESG strategies if it's market neutral. But if trustees or investment managers wish to pursue an ESG specific policy, and that's not likely to lead to the best possible economic return for underlying US clients, this may cause an issue. There may be obstacles in that regard. So what we're seeing there is that while there are large flows on the US side into ESG products, a lot of those are actually generated by the new generation, the millennials, who are generally more concerned with ESG concerns, it seems that the EU is actually taking a lead on the ESG front at the moment. And so I'm going to leave it there. I've just left my details on the slide, but I'd be happy to take questions or to go back and deal with some of the questions that we heard from earlier on the earlier slides.